The Rape of the Mind, Chapter 11. During disturbed times such as this, the thoughts of everyone follow the diplomatic play going on at the various political conferences. It will be worthwhile to investigate whether it is possible for the leaders of nations to arrive at a common understanding as a result of mutual exchange of words, ideas, and the negotiating of treaties. Yet, the various cultures in the world and the different ideologies not only speak different languages, but even their ways of thinking are different. Unobtrusively, our personal past and our cultural environment creep into our thinking habits. Our feelings and thoughts are conditioned and coerced by various social influences. It is already possible to bring at the surface some of the illusion and the prejudices people have about one another. We may say that the special environment in which people develop and the habits they build up foster subtle illusion and delusions in persons, of which they are, for the most part, unaware. Through research in the field, anthropology and psychology have been able to compare different ideologies in people by observing the growth of the wholesome and the unwholesome in the child, in groups, in tribes, and lastly, in nations. The findings call our attention to the difficult art of argument in situations where there is scarcely any common ground of communication and understanding. In a study of mental coercion, we have to trace some of these psychological influences which condition our attitude in life, the affirmation of our own errors. The lie I tell 10 times gradually becomes half-truth to me, and as I continue to tell my half-truth to others, it becomes my cherished delusions. We rediscover this phenomena every day in that huge laboratory of human relations we call psychological counseling and psychotherapy. Let us just look at one simple example. The case of a perfectly healthy child who decided one day that she does not want to go to school because schoolwork seemed to be very difficult. So she tells her mother that she has a headache, and the mother agrees to let her stay at home. Thus the girl avoids the schoolwork she dreads and gets the additional gratification of her mother's solicitous and tender nursing. The next time the girl wants to stay at home, it is easier to pretend she has a headache. And that time it is easier still. Gradually, the girl herself begins to believe in her recurrent illness. Her concerns bothered her the first time she lied, but now her initial lie has become the ingenious truth to her. By the time the heroine becomes a grown woman, she will have to consult with a doctor about her constantly recurring headaches. Doctor and patient will have to spend many hours untangling the web of half-lies, innuendos, self-pitying complaints until the patient rediscovered that her headaches all began at that one day she didn't want to go to school. Delusional headaches afflict the world itself. Political demagoguery is to some extent a problem in our country. The particular form this demagoguery takes only a passing phase, and when our current dragons and inner phantoms have been laid to rest, the eternal demagogue may arise anew. He will accuse others of conspiracy in order to prove his own importance. He will try to intimidate those who are neither so iron-fisted nor so hot-headed as he, and he will drag some people into the web of his delusions. Perhaps he will wear a mantle of martyrdom to arouse the tears of the weak-hearted. With his emotionalism and suspicion, he will shatter the trust of citizens in one another. His delusion of grandeur will infect those insecure souls who hope that some of his dictatorial grammar will rub off on them. Unfortunately, the problem of delusion has been studied almost exclusively in terms of its pathological manifestation. The psychiatrist who has encountered delusion of grandeur in his patients has in the past lacked the philosophical and the sociological background necessary to enable him to form comparison between his patients' delusional systems and mass delusions in the world. In dealing with the patient suffering from megalomania and persecution mania, he has tended to rely too much on the hypotheses which explain pathological delusions as a product of anatomical changes in the individual brain. He has not given enough attention to question of whether or not these phenomena are in any way related to an abnormal way of thinking in a physical normal person. Since the growth of anthropology and the social science in the last decades, new light has been thrown on the subject of mass feelings and mass delusions. Obviously, these are not phenomena which a pathologist can examine under a microscope. They demand a knowledge of history and social psychology and of all studies which concern interhuman relation and man's collective thinking. To arrive at a critical stage of study of this subject, it is necessary to divest oneself of various fixed philosophical ideas which have dominated scientific thought since Aristotle. There is, for example, the doctrine of the identity of all thinking processes and possible universality of human understanding. This is essentially founded on the belief that all human beings think in the same way. But against this hypothesis is the observable truth that philosophers themselves have the utmost difficulty in reaching mutual understanding. This may be largely due to the fact that different men have different methods and standards of thinking. For centuries, science has adopted the Aristotelian dictum that most thought is carried out according to established rules of logic, which apply in the same way as laws of nature. It was the philosopher Francis Bacon who first pointed out in his theory of idols that although the laws of logic and clear thinking certainly exist, men may or may not take use of them, depending on the emotional circumstances. Thoughts are often the theatrical curtains to conceal personal passions and reactions. Depending on the emotional circumstances, thoughts are often the theatrical curtains to conceal personal passions and reactions. In this statement, the philosopher who lived during the Shakespeare's time might almost be attacking the seeming logic of the modern demagoguery. Since the Renaissance, therefore, it has been acknowledged that human feelings and personal inclination mold and direct thought, and this point of view rather are found its most moving expression in the works of Spinoza and Pascal. When we come into contact with the phenomena of corrective passion and mass delusions, it is impossible to keep modern psychology out of the picture, whether we look at it philosophically or politically. For when examining this problem, we are immediately confronted with the question: do these disquieting phenomena in group life, which led to so much mutual misunderstanding, arise from the fact that the group is in a particular, immature, and adolescent phase of psychological and political development? It will be illuminating and may help us answer the question if we study briefly the history of growth of the consciousness and awareness in the individual mind as it passes through successive stages from infancy to maturity. Since we can, in fact, find a parallel between such stages of growth in the individual and the human group. Stages of thinking and delusions. Here, I follow in part the classification of F. Ferenczi and that of my own book on delusions. The psyche is constantly confronted with and communicating with the outside world, and at every phase of individual development that world and its events are experienced differently. Although different scientists have drawn different conclusions about the various phases and their implications, the very recognition of change and growth of personal outlook is one of the most important scientific findings in psychology and is agreed on by all psychologists. Let me briefly explain here the development approach to human psychology. It is not the only one, but it will serve to illustrate the tremendous impact of immature and delusional thinking on our financial opinion. Development psychology, as studied in children and primitives, posits at the origin of thinking, in both the individual and the race, a horizontary stage of the mind in which there is no experience of difference between the inside and the outside world. The mental separation and distinction between the self and the world has not yet taken place. The psyche is felt to the omnipotent. All that is experienced inside the self is attributed to the universe as well as imagined to part of the universe. According to development psychology, the infant experiences the world in this way, and in certain types of insanity, the adult will revert to this hallucinatory stage. Yet even mature man does not succeed completely in separating internal fantasies from outside reality, and often he thinks that his private and subjective moods are caused by some external actuality. In the next stage, that of animistic thinking, there is still a partial sense of oneness between the ego and the world. The individual's inner experience, his fears, his feelings are projected onto seeming causative agents in the outside world. The outside world is a continued demonic threat to him. The child who bumps against the table projects onto the table a hostile living power and hits back. The primitive tradesman, haunted by beasts of prey, attributes to the animal he feared a divine power, that of a hostile god. The entire outside world may in fact be peopled with fears of men. In times of panic and fear, we all may populate our neighborhood with non-existent traitors or fifth columnists. Our animistic thinking is continually busy accusing others of what actually occurs inside our own minds. Nowadays, there are no devils and ghosts in trees and in wild animals. They have made their homes in the various scapegoats created by dictators and demagogues. The third stage is that of the magical thinking, in which there is still a sense of intimate connection between man and his outside world. However, man places himself more in opposition to the world than in an union with it. He wants to negotiate with the mysterious powers around him. Magic is in fact the simplest strategy of man. He has discovered that he can manipulate the world with signs and gestures, or sometimes with real actions or changes. He erects totem poles and sacrificial blocks. He makes talisman and strange medicines. He uses words as powerful signs to change the world. He develops a ritual to satisfy his need for coming to terms with the outside world. Which one of us has not felt a sudden desire to count cobblestone, or is not the jealous possessor of an amulet or some other sacred token whose power will be lost if its existence were known to others? Immature as they are, these tokens serve to build up happiness and good life. We all live in the world of magic and are caught in the delusions of happy manipulation of nature. The modern tribe drives around with mechanized cars and becomes a megalomaniac sorcerer of the wheel. Millions of victims are brought to the altar of the Godspeed because of our hidden delusion that frenzied rapidity prolongs life. The engine and the gadget have replaced the more mysterious amulets of earlier days. Knowledge is still in the service of power instead of its service of understanding. In the past phase of mental development, man makes a complete separation between himself and the outside world. He not only lives with things and tries to manipulate them, but he also lives in the opposition to them. In this phase of mature reality confrontation, man becomes an observer of his own life. He recognizes the abyss of his own being. He sees his body and mind as separate from the world. With hands, ears, eyes, and his controlling mind, he confronts a reality. He steps back from the world and observes it. He is, in fact, the only animal that walks erect, straightforward facing the world. He is the only animal that uses his hands and his senses as verifying instruments. Gradually, his own mind-body becomes an instrument whose drives he may accept or reject. Only man is able to see his drive and instincts as either dangerous or useful. Man not only knows an external imposed fear, but he knows an inner fear of losing the inner controls he has acquired at so high a price. With arms and hands, man reaches out, not only toward the outside which he once hoped to conquer with magic gestures as a baby does, but also he knowingly reaches out towards an inside world. Mature man lives between an inner and an outer world. There is something tragic about this rebellious process of becoming conscious of a separate inner and outer reality. In becoming mature, man awakens from the sweet primitive dream in which he was part of an individual whole, part of a nervic world of equanimity. The sense of lost unity with the universe lingers on, and in moments of mass tension, or in times of crisis, he reaches towards that ancient experience of impersonal, irresponsible bliss. Utter passivity or self-destruction, artificial ecstasy obtained by means of drugs, the suicidal wish of eternal sleep, all are devices by which man hopes to fulfill that internal yearning. At what stage in connection with these developments of human experience may we speak of delusions? When the member of the primitive tribe placates the mysterious and hostile world by prayer to his totem animal, we do not call these delusions, but if a man who has attained to more advanced stages of thinking relapses into such a primitive habit of thought, then it is possible to call this falling back, retrogression, a delusion. The loss of verifiable reality. Delusion we may thus tentatively define as the loss of an independent verifiable reality. with a consequent relapse into a more primitive stage of awareness, just as the young woman we spoke about earlier began to believe in and suffer from her headaches, so the man who tells his primitive fantasy first as a rumor and then as a factual truth gradually loses his awareness that his initial statements were in fact deceits, and his delusions become a kind of permanent petrification of his original primitive wishful thinking. There are several factors which promote deluded thinking. Retrogression and primitivization may occur as a result of physical disease, particularly diseases of the brain, and it is with this type of delusion that psychiatrists deal. Many brain diseases put out of operation the brain cortex, the organ which developed last in the evolutionary process and which makes us aware and controls our thinking. When this disturbance of function happens, genetically older types of brain functioning have to take over. Most of the causes of delusions are not purely organic, however. The same effect of regression may be produced by hypnosis and mass hypnosis, which, by dislocating the higher forms of alert consciousness, reduce the subject to the primitive stage of collective participation and oneness experience. If awareness and reality confrontation become rigid and automatic, if man does not look for alert and repeated verification on what he finds in the world, he may develop delusions, idea not adapted to reality situation. Apparently, the human being requires constant confrontation and verification with various aspects of reality if he is to remain alive and alert. When experience is petrified into dogma, the dogma itself stands in the way of the new verification of the new truth. The delusion of a nation that calls itself the chosen country makes it harder for that nation to collaborate with other nations. How deeply involved the process of thought control is within the general formation of ideas in our time can be shown by the following experience. After the First World War, I made the acquaintance of the German philosopher dedicated to the idealistic philosophy of his country. Germany went through a creative phase, new ideas of fraternity and world peace. Germany, the defeated country, would show its spiritual power. During our vacation, we walked together through the sunny mountains of Ticino, devoted our philosophical conversation to eternal yearnings of mankind for harmony and friendship. We became friends and wrote to one another about our mutual work, till the shadow of totalitarianism came over his country. At first, he was skeptical and even critical about Nazism. Our correspondence diminished, and when he gradually became Geschart and a member of the party, the final mental privilege followed. I never heard about him anymore. So many philosophers surrender their theoretical thinking under the impact of powerful mass emotions. The reason lies not only in anxiety and submissiveness. It is such a deeper emotional process. People want to speak the language of their country and fatherland. In order to breathe, they have to identify with the ideological cliches of their surrounding. Spiritually, they cannot stand alone. Stephen Zheng wrote during the First World War that his inner process of speaking along with the chauvinistic voices around him was experienced by him as a deeper inner conflict. I did not have the will anymore to be just the others. Mass delusions. It is interesting to note that the phenomena of institutionalized mass delusions has so far received a little scientific treatment. Although the term is bandied about whenever the problem of political propaganda are discussed, but science has shied away from scrutinizing the corrective mental aberration. We call mass delusion when it is connected with present-day affairs. It is the historical examples, such as witchcraft and certain forms of mass hysteria, that have been examined in great detail. In our era of warring ideologies, in a time of battle for man's mind, this question demands attention. What is mass delusions? How does it arise? What can we do to combat it? The fact that I have made an analogy between totalitarian frame of mind and the disease of the mental withdrawal known as schizophrenia indicates that I consider totalitarian ideology delusional and the totalitarian frame of mind a pathological distortion that may occur in anyone. When we tentatively define delusion as the loss of an independent, verifiable reality, with a constant relapse into more primitive state of awareness, we can see how the phenomena of totalitarianism itself can be considered delusional. For it is delusional, and are adapted to reality to think of a man as an obedient machine. It is delusional to deny this dynamic nature and to try to arrest his thinking and acting at an infertile stage of submission to authority. It is delusional to believe that there is any one simple answer to many problems with which life confronts us. It is delusional to believe that man is so rigid, so yielding in his structure that he has no ambivalences, no doubts, no conflicts, no warring drives within him. When thinking is isolated without free exchange with other minds and can no longer expand, delusions may follow. Whenever ideas are compartmentalized behind and between curtains, the process of continued alert confrontation of facts and reality is hampered. The system freezes, becomes rigid, and dies of delusions. Examples of this can be found in very small communities cut off from the world. On fishing vessels which have been at sea a long time, contagious religious mania coupled with ritual murder has been known to break out. In small village communities, there are instances of corrective delusions, often under the influence of one obsessed person. The same thing happens in more gigantic totalitarian communities cut off from contact with the rest of the world. Is it not what happened in Haida, Germany, where free verification and self-correction were forbidden? Indeed, we can show that historically, this is the case with every secluded civilization. If there is not interchange with other people, the civilization degenerates, becomes the victim of its own delusions, and dies. We can phrase the concept of delusions in a different way. It is a more primitive, distorted form of thinking found in groups or individuals, looked at only from their limited viewpoint. Delusional thinking doesn't know the concept of delusional thinking. The fakir lying on his bed on his nails would be called a deluded man if he exhibited his devotion of Faith Avenue. The fakir lying on his bed of nails would be called a deluded man if he exhibited his devotion of the Fifth Avenue, but among his own people, his behavior is considered saintly and eminently sane. A member of the primitive tribe will not see in the ceremony of devil exorcism or a rival meeting an instance of mass delusion. But a man who has passed through this stage of mental development to a level of greater perspective and awareness will recognize that delusions' notions lie behind such ceremonies. Whether or not we are able to detect delusion when it appears depends entirely on circumstances, upon the state of civilization in which we live, upon the groups and the social class of which we belong. For delusions and retrogression are terms which imply a special social and intellectual level of awareness. That is why it is so difficult to detect the delusions and the primitive rituals in our own mindset. Our present-day civilization is full of mass delusions, prejudices, and corrective errors which can be recognized if viewed from above, but which cannot be detected if they are seen from within. While the delusion of witchcraft has been banished, we have never freed ourselves from the delusion of cultural or racial inferiority and superiority. Medieval mass delusions such as Tarantism and St. Vitus dance are little known among Western nations. In their praise, we have mass meetings with shouting crowds expressing its delusional ecstasy, their affirmation to some political delusions. Instead of the dance fury, we have the raving phrases of the motto, or the passive peeping contagion of television screens. As we saw in the chapter of totalitarian, mass delusion can be induced. It is simply a question of organizing and manipulating collective feelings in the proper way. If one can isolate the mass, allow no free thinking, no free exchange, no outside corrective, and can hypnotize the group daily with noises, with press and radio and television, with fear and pseudo-enthusiasm, any delusion can be instilled. People will begin to accept the most primitive and inappropriate acts. Outside occurrences are usually the triggers that unleash hidden hysterical and delusional complexes in people. Collective madness justifies the repressed personal madness in each individual. That is why it is so easy to organize people into a mass hysteria of war. The outside enemy is who is attacked by the vitupertive slogans is merely the scapegoat or substitute of all the anger and anxiety that lives inside the harassed people. Delusions, carefully implanted, are difficult to collect. Reasoning no longer has value. For the lower, more animal type of thinking becomes deaf to any thought of a higher level. If one reasons with a totalitarian who has been impregnated with official cliches, he will sooner or later withdraw his own fortress or corrective totalitarian thinking. The mass delusion that gives his feelings belonging, of greatness, of omnipotence, is dearer to him than his personal awareness and understanding. The lonely prisoner in a totalitarian prison camp is more easily compelled to surrender gradually to the corrective thinking of his guardian when part of his own infertile thinking has been conditioned to give into a stronger suggestive power. He has to communicate with his guardian lest he be delivered to his own primitive delusion. Only a few remained their true selves in that heroic battle. The situation of our prisoner of war in Korea, who lived in there for months and years, cannot be studied without taking into account the atmosphere of mass delusions. In a sphere filled with rumors without an opportunity to verify the facts, the mind is ever on the alert, but its observations are distorted. The process of mass brainwashing, with continued propaganda, made it very difficult for the individual to observe his comrade objectively. In such surroundings, it is easy to make an innocent scapegoat for all the suffering of the group, and facts can easily be hallucinated in such an atmosphere of mass contagion. In one of the prisoner camps, I had to make a report about a man who was exorcised and even attacked by others because of his brutal homosexual behavior. During the investigation, no fact, no victim could be reported. Rumors were that Prenti, expressing hatred toward a lonely, sarcastic, and social being who had aroused the latent homosexual feelings of other campers, thereby attacking their manliness. No prisoner of war accused of collaboration with the enemy should be convicted without a study having been made of the rumors rampant in his camp. In totalitarian surroundings, hardly anyone keeps his thinking free from contagion, and nearly everyone becomes, albeit temporarily, the victim of delusion. The danger of mental contagion. Indeed, there is a continued danger of mental contagion. People are in constant physical exchange with one another. As a country, we have to ask what dangerous mental population may come to us from other side of the border. Let me make it crystal clear that I am far from insensitive to a danger of totalitarian subversion and aggression which we are now faced. My own experiences with the Nazis made it painfully obvious to me that these dangers must not be minimized. As a psychologist too, I am deeply aware of the contagious nature of the totalitarian propaganda and of the fact that free citizens in the free country must be on their guard to protect themselves. But we must learn to fight these dangers in democratic ways, and I am afraid that too often in our fight against them, we may take a leaf from the totalitarian book. Let me cite but one example of this. The Feinberg Law in New York State, enacted in order to protect children against the dissemination of dangerous political propaganda, is partially based on the concept of mental contagion. It aims to protect the schools against the subtle infiltration of subversive ideas. It seems at first slight like a simple solution. You just stop subversion before it can affect the impressionable minds of our children. But the fact remains that it presents all kinds of psychological difficulties. In our fear of being polluted, we create norms and schemes against which we measure the acceptability of unorthodox ideas. We forget that the presence of minority ideas, acceptable or not, is one of the ways which we protect ourselves against the creeping growth of conformist majority thinking in us. U.S. Supreme Court Justice Hugo Black, in his dissenting opinion in the Feinberg Law, made this point. This is another of those rapidly multiplying legislative enactments which make it dangerous. To think or say anything except what a transient majority happens to approve at a moment. Basically, this law rests on the belief of the government should supervise and limit the flow of ideas into the minds of men. The tendencies of such governmental policy is to mold people into a common intellectual pattern. Quite a different government policy rests on the belief that the government should leave the mind and the spirit of man absolutely free. Such a government policy encourages varied intellectual outlooks in the belief that the best views will prevail. This policy of freedom is, in my judgment, embodied in the First Amendment and made applicable to the states by the 14th. Because of this policy, Public officials cannot constitutionally vest with powers to select the ideas people can think about, censor the public views they can express, or choose the person or groups people can associate with. Public officials with such powers are not public servants, they are public masters. We cannot prevent one mental contagion through enforcing another. The only way we can give man a strength to withstand mental infection is through giving him the utmost freedom in the exchange of ideas. People have to learn to ask questions without demanding that they are answered immediately. The free man is the man who learns to live with problems in hope that they will be solved sometime, either in his own generation or the next. Man's curiosity and inquisitiveness have to be stimulated. We have to fight man's growing fear of thinking for himself, of being original, and of being willful to fight for what and believes in. On the other hand, we also have to learn to resist ideas. Governments may be overthrown not only by physical violence, but also by mental violence, by suggestive and menticidal penetration of young minds, by rigid conditioning, regimentation, and prohibition of dissent, the explanation delusions. One of the most coercive delusions is the explanation delusion. The need to explain and interpret everything because the person has a simple ideology in his pocket. Outwittingly, the victim of this delusion wraps the magical cloak of omniscience around himself, and this provokes awe and submission in those men who have a stronger need for a rational explanation of phenomena they do not understand. The quack, for instance, with his gesture of omniscience pushes his victim into a kind of nothingness so that he feels himself become smaller and smaller in relation to the greater mysteries of the world. It is this compulsive need to be the wise guy and the magician who knows all the answers that we so often find in the totalitarian world, and nobody, your author included, is completely free from seizing these premature answers. It is among the intelligentsia, and especially among those who like to play with thoughts and concepts without really taking part in the cultural endeavors of their epoch, that we often find the glib compulsion to explain everything and to understand nothing. Their retreat into intellectual isolation and ivory tower philosophy is a source of such hostility and suspicion from those who receive the stones of intellectualism instead of bread of understanding. The intelligentsia has a special role in our democratic world as teachers of ideas, but every teaching is an emotional relation, a matter of loving your students. It is moving among them and taking part in their doubts in order to share together adventure of common exploration of the unknown. Paradoxically, we may say that we need the experience with the totalitarian if only to discover the reflection of the rigidness in our own democratic system, the liberation from magic thinking. In our Western civilization, the growth of mass media of communication has increased the influence of corrective pressure on both our prejudices and our unbiased thinking. We live in a world of constant noise which captures our minds even when we act not aware of it. Already we have our society the problem of the lonely and heard voices. I am convinced that there are many wise men among us whose voices and learning will help us correct that part of thinking which is delusional, but their wise words are shouted down by the excess of noises from elsewhere. In our society, a man cannot simply communicate his wisdom and insights anymore in order to be heard. He has to advertise and fortify with megacyclic power and unofficial labels. An organization must stand behind him and must make sure that he will be rightly teamed so that there will be listeners to receive his message. He must have an acknowledgeable and an official diploma, otherwise his voice is lost. To collect mass delusion is one of the most difficult tasks of democracy. Democracy pleads for freedom of thought, and this means that it demands the right of all men to test all forms of corrective emotions and corrective thinking. This testing is possible only if constant personal and corrective self-criticism is encouraged. Democracy must face this task of preserving mobility of thought in order to free itself from blind fears and magic. The crash and the impact of all variety of opinions which are characteristic for democracy may not directly produce truth, but they prepare the way. At this very moment, the whole world dances around our delusions, around the magic idea that the material and the military power behind an argument will bring us nearer to the truth and nearer to safety. Yet, one push on the button on the atomic missile may lead us all to mutual suicide. In a world of warring and contrasting thoughts and delusions, the solution lies in the denialation of frontiers, of awareness of mutual limits. This disagreement on what it is we disagree about is the first step to understanding. End of chapter 11.